Peace talks cave. Humans' reply breaks the galactic throne. The notebook was already open when the Convener Prime entered the room. Sunketh logged that detail first, before the delegate count, before the atmospheric readings, before she had even confirmed her recording array was live. She did not know why she had logged it. The notebook was a small thing, gray cloth covers, worn corners, a pen clipped to the spine. Nothing that should have registered before the 11 civilizations filling the chamber, before the crystalline table worth more than most human warships, before Las Erdon himself, 400 kilograms of armored exoskeleton, and 2 centuries of unbroken procedural authority, moving to his seat at the head of the room. She logged the notebook first. She would not understand why until much later. The deliberative annex of Velreth smelled of compressed transit stone and recycled atmospheric mix, a mineral dryness that caught in the secondary membrane beneath Sunketh's jaw. Every session started this way, the air calibrated to neutral, the walls absorbing the upper register of sound the way they always did, and the analysts arranged along the inner tier with their instruments already running. Sunketh's station was the third from the left, where the sightline to the main table was clearest. She had sat in this exact position through 9 formal sessions. She had never once opened her sub-file labeled anomalous items before a session began. She opened it now. She typed, object paper handwritten, no category. She left the entry there and closed the file. Admiral Vale Casson sat alone on humanity's side of the table. No second chair, no aide, no communications officer, no legal staff. Just a human woman in a gray diplomatic coat, left-handed, the notebook positioned at a slight angle to her body that Sunketh's instruments read as low-grade postural tension. The Sothran hegemony's military attaché, standing in the observer tier above the main floor, had already filed a query through the Annex's administrative system asking whether humanity was planning to send additional delegates. Sunketh had seen the query. She had not answered it. She was watching Casson's pen. It was moving. Stay close. What she writes in that room will matter in ways I am still working out. 3 days before, Sunketh had run the final pre-session analysis on the human delegation. The profile was thorough, 47 pages, every known intelligence asset, every confirmed or suspected capability, cross-referenced against 6 independent threat models. Admiral Vale Casson appeared on page 2, flagged as a mid-tier intelligence officer recommissioned to flag rank for this negotiation, a signal the convocation's analysts had read as desperation, the promotion of a bureaucrat into a seat that should have held a combat commander. They had noted her left-handedness. They had noted the notebook, in a prior session where she had carried it to a preliminary review. They had classified it, probable record-keeping device, low priority. They had not noted the angle, the 17 degrees. Sunketh had not noted the angle either. She noted it now, and opened a second sub-file she did not yet have a name for. Las Erdon's entry ended the pre-session murmur the way a temperature drop ends ambient sound. He was 2.4 meters of bilateral symmetry, with a third stabilizing limb folded at his back, a body built for rooms that were designed to make things feel small. His faceplates cycled a slow, deliberate blue-gray as he settled into the primary seat. That color meant he was processing the room as a data environment. Sunketh had seen that color at 6 of the 7 annexations she had observed in her career. It meant he had already decided the outcome and was now cataloging the details. He had presided over 7 annexations. He had never been in a room where the result was not certain before he sat down. He glanced at the notebook. His faceplates did not change color. The reading of terms took 40 minutes. Las Erdon delivered the convocation's document himself, not through a proxy, which was unusual. He had chosen to treat this session as a formality so complete it required no ritual distance. 11 items. Full military withdrawal to within the Terran boundary, territorial contraction, reparation transfer, subordinate protectorate status, reviewed at 10-year intervals. A framework that had taken 6 months to draft and which, Sunketh knew, had been circulated to member governments before humanity had been told negotiations were scheduled. Casson wrote through all of it. Not notes, not a reaction log. She wrote steadily, the the pen moving in the long strokes of someone working through a document of her own. The notebook opened to a page that was already half filled when she sat down. She did not look up when Las Erdon reached item 4, territorial contraction, which was the clause that reduced the Terran Republic to a belt of 11 systems around their home world. She did not look up at item 7, which established the reparation structure. She looked up once briefly, when Las Erdon said the word protectorate, and then she looked back down. Soon Keth's instruments logged no stress response at any point during the reading. None. She checked the calibration. The calibration was fine. She reran the baseline. Cassin's cardiovascular output was steady. Her vocal register, when she spoke, the Terran Republic has understood the terms, was level. Level in a way that the instruments did not know how to file. Las Erdon asked if she required clarification on any point. Cassin said no. She said she would need one standard day to consult with the Terran Council, and she asked that this be granted before the session concluded. Las Erdon said yes before the delegates around him had finished nodding. It was not a concession. It was the last courteous gesture before the end of a thing. The outcome was not in question. One day made no difference. 3 members of the Kelthari delegation made audible remarks as the session closed, short, overlapping sounds in their resonant vocal range that the translation system rendered as standard delay procedure. Expected. Then, the document is already filed. Then, from the one standing nearest to Soon Keth's tier, I wonder if the pen is a recorder. Cassin looked up at that one. She looked at the Kelthari delegate for exactly 2 seconds. Then she wrote something down and capped the pen. Soon Keth tagged the moment. She did not know what to tag it as, so she tagged it 17 deg, 2 sec, no vocal response. The chamber cleared in 9 minutes, delegates to their atmospheric quarters, attaches to their secondary stations. Las Erdon's protocol secretary cycling amber as he tried to collate the post-session communications before the priority queue overloaded his processing thread. Soon Keth stayed at her station until the last Orovith aide left. Then she pulled up Cassin's full intelligence profile again and read the section on psychological underreaction under stress. It was 3 lines long. The profile said, noted behavioral suppression in high-pressure environments, not confirmed as intentional, low priority. She closed the file. She opened the subfile with no name and typed a single line, behavioral suppression, confirmed duration, 40 minutes, no baseline deviation, method unknown. Then she started her overnight summary. The human side of the annex at night was quiet in a way that alien structures rarely managed. The transit stone walls absorbed too well, took the ambient hum of equipment, and flattened it into something close to silence. Soon Keth worked through the feed from 3 intelligence streams at once, the secondary membrane beneath her jaw periodically shifting as she processed competing priority flags. The picture was clear. She had expected it to be clear, but clarity still had a feeling to it, and this one felt like finishing a long calculation correctly. Human communications traffic had spiked 340% in the 6 hours since the session ended. Government emergency channels, hardened military frequencies, encrypted civilian relay traffic, all of it elevated, all of it showing the behavioral profile of a governing body under extreme pressure. She had read that profile before. She had read it on 4 other species before their formal capitulations. The volume was right. The frequency distribution was right. The timing was right. A species about to accept terms behaved exactly like this. Its government running emergency sessions, its military commanders entering protected positions, its civilian infrastructure going to contingency mode. It looked like exactly what it was. She wrote that in her summary and moved on. The territory division was already in progress. 3 delegations had submitted preliminary governance claims on human outer systems, pending formal ratification of the terms. The Kelthari Dominion's claim document, 40 pages, 7 annexes, historically precise, had arrived in her queue at 200. She skimmed it. The Kelthari liked records. They had been building this document for 4 months. Soon Keth approved it for logging and noted that the Terran Outer Systems administrative infrastructure would need to be assessed for compatibility with Dominion protocols. She noted this calmly, because it was a reasonable administrative step, because the session tomorrow would produce the formal document, because this was how these things went. She noted it and then, for reasons she could not immediately identify, reopened the subfile with no name. The entry was still there. Behavioral suppression confirmed, method unknown. She added a second line. The pen did not stop during the territorial reading. She stared at that line for a while. Then she filed the overnight summary to Convocation Intelligence recommendation. Standard terms, no escalation required, and went to sleep. She slept for 3 hours. She did not dream because Orovith did not dream, but in the processing suspension that served the same function, something kept cycling. The image of a pen that did not stop, and a notebook angled 17 degrees, and a woman who had been in a room where her species' territory was being divided and had shown, by every instrument Sunketh had access to, no fear at all. The summary went out at 3:47. At 400, the Sothran hegemony's military attaché submitted a revised naval redeployment schedule for the Outer Terran systems. At 500, the Kelthari archivist filed a second query asking whether the notebook might be a recording device. A different query than the one from yesterday, more formally worded, routed through the official channel rather than the administrative system. Sunketh read it when she woke. She read it twice. Then she filed it without response because it was not her department, because it was probably not a recording device. She spent 20 minutes before the session, reviewing everything the convocation had on humanity's stellar observation capability. It was a thin file. Humans watched stars the way most species did, passively, with long-range arrays, building predictive models from radiation signatures and gravitational variants. Standard practice. No anomalous findings in any surveilled system. No indication of any capability beyond observation. She closed the file, picked up her instrument array, and walked back to the third station from the left. Casson was already there. The notebook was already open. Casson did not acknowledge Sunketh's arrival. She was already writing when Sunketh reached her station, the same steady movement of the pen, the same blank face that meant she was moving through a document she had already composed somewhere else. The notebook sat at 17 degrees. Las Erdon entered at 900 precisely. The delegates assembled without the precession murmur. Something in the air had changed. Sunketh's instruments registered it before she could name it, a shift in the room's atmospheric processing, a slight increase in the subaudible harmonic frequency that indicated collective stress response. The Orovith did not show stress through facial expression the way humans did. They showed it through the frequency of their breathing, through micro-adjustments in their stabilizing limbs, through the way their faceplates cycled colors. Las Erdon's plates were cycling blue-gray again. They had not stopped cycling since the day before. He asked if Admiral Casson had reached a conclusion. Casson set down the pen and looked at him directly. The Terran Republic rejects the document in full. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of 11 species recalculating, of analysts running the same data through revised models, of a room where something fundamental had shifted, and no one had yet adjusted their bearing to account for it. The Sothran hegemony's military attaché, who had submitted the redeployment schedule at 500, stopped mid-breath. The Kelthari archivist's secondary palps, the delicate sensory organs along their lateral edges, flattened slightly. Las Erdon's faceplates cycled once, twice, then stopped. They held steady at a deep gray blue that Sunketh had only ever seen once before, at the Thelketh annexation, when the defending species lead negotiator had presented a document the convocation had not expected to receive. "You reject," Las Erdon said, "not a question." "All 11 items," Casson said. She picked the notebook back up. "The Terran Republic has a counter-proposal." Sunketh's field notes from that moment later would read, "Speaker shows no hesitation. Counter-proposal was prepared before the first session. This was not a reaction. This was a plan." Casson stood. The table was long, 8 meters of compressed transit stone and crystalline inlay, and she walked its length without looking at any delegate except Las Erdon. When she stopped, she was close enough that she could have touched the table if she had wanted to. She did not. She opened the notebook to a page marked with a small ink notation that Soon Keth's instruments could not quite resolve. "The Terran Republic demands," Casson said, "full military withdrawal from all systems containing human populations within 72 hours. The laughter began before her voice had finished traveling through the chamber. 11 kinds of laughter, the Sothran hegemony's booming harmonic that bypassed the translation system entirely, the Kelthari dominion's resonant clicks and tonal inversions, the Iron Concordat's precise, measured amusement that sounded like struck metal. Soon Keth did not look at the chamber. She looked at Casson. Casson was writing. "Admiral," Las Erdon said, and the laughter stopped because his voice had authority built into it, authority that did not require volume. "You are aware that the Convocation has committed naval presence representing the combined capability of 11 civilizations. You are aware that your species force projection is limited to 3 escort vessels. You are aware of the comparative calculation." "I am aware," Casson said. Las Erdon stood. He was 2.4 meters of exoskeleton built for authority, and he moved to the center of the chamber the way a thing moves that has never had to question whether it owns the space it is walking through. He pulled a display panel from the table's surface, a gesture so casual it was almost gentle, and the holographic field above the table ignited with fleet schematic. Blue icons for Convocation naval assets, red icons for Terran vessels. The mathematical comparison resolved itself instantly. The red was so small it barely registered as color. "Here," Las Erdon said, "is the naval differential. Here is the population ratio. Here is the territorial control distribution." He gestured through each schematic. The numbers resolved below each one, large and absolute. "Tell me, Admiral, what I am missing in this calculation. Tell me what variable would produce a different outcome." Casson did not look at the display. She was still writing. "I have read every intelligence file on your species," Las Erdon said. His faceplate cycled a deliberate official blue. "I have cross-referenced every known asset, every documented capability, every implied reserve. My analysts have run behavioral predictions through 9 independent models. The outcome of this negotiation is not in question. What I wish to understand before I formalize the surrender terms is whether you are aware of this." "I am aware," Casson said. She capped the pen. She closed the notebook. She set it deliberately in the center of the table. The chamber reacted in the way a single organism reacts when something unexpected enters its field, a ripple of attention, a recalibration of focus. Delegates leaned forward. The Kelthari archivist's secondary palps flattened completely, a reflex that, in Soon Keth's experience, indicated that something had been categorized as requiring immediate documentation. The Sothran military attaché stood up. "It has been here," the attaché said. "Not a question either. A statement delivered like a condemnation." "Yes," Casson said. "You brought it into the negotiation deliberately," the attaché said. "Which means you believe it contains information that changes the outcome of the comparative calculation." "I believe it contains information," Casson said, "that it might be worth knowing before you withdraw." Las Erdon's faceplates went still. Not cycling, not blue, not gray. Still. The stabilizing limb that was normally folded at his back shifted slightly, unfolding a fraction of an inch, a gesture so small that most species would have missed it. Soon Keth did not miss it. She had been trained to catch the micro-movements that indicated a command structure, recognizing that its threat assessment model had hit an input it could not process. She had seen this one time before, at the Thelketh annexation, at the moment when the defending species lead negotiator had presented the sealed archive, and Las Erdon had understood that the outcome of that negotiation was no longer certain. He understood it now. "I want to examine it," the Kelthari archivist said. "No," Casson said. "Then you are bluffing," the Sothran military attaché said, and there was something in his voice that sounded like he was very much hoping to be right. "I am not bluffing," Casson said, "but the notebook is not for examination. I will read to you from the relevant sections. I will answer any question about the content. You will not touch it." Soon Keth made a note. "Subject treats the object as contaminated or dangerous." The containment protocol suggests high-value information rather than bluff. Probability assessment. 70% real content, 30% elaborate performance. She would, over the next 30 minutes, revise that probability downward significantly. Las Erdon asked what sections were relevant. Casson opened the notebook to a page that had no bookmark, that she found through what looked like memory rather than searching. She began to read. Thennic orbital, she said. Primary star shows quantum instability markers in the archived monitoring data. 22 months of baseline drift, suppressed by standard archival lag in your own data routing protocol. No external agency involved. Soon-Keth's instruments did something Soon-Keth's instruments were not supposed to do. They registered something she could not name. Verification check, Casson continued, should take your own analysis division approximately 9 minutes from this moment. At 14:07 standard, the primary will undergo irreversible destabilization. The orbital will lose primary power within 2 minutes of that event. Long-range sensors will confirm the stellar event within 4 minutes. You will know, at that point, that you can verify this prediction without accessing any external data source. She looked up from the notebook. You will be able to verify it, she said, from your own archived monitoring array, from data you already have. The chamber did not move. Soon-Keth pulled the Thennic Systems monitoring array feed and ran it against the archived data Casson had just described. Archival lag, standard suppression protocol, quantum instability markers, 22 months. Every single element was there. It was all real. It was all, and this was the part that Soon-Keth could not immediately process. It was all something that no convocation analyst had ever thought to check. She checked it now. She ran verification against the hegemony's own core data systems. The instability flag was live. It was real. It was in the hegemony's own archived monitoring queue, logged as low priority, flagged for review at the next quarterly assessment cycle, which was 7 weeks away, which would be 7 weeks too late. She filed that finding in her system. Then she opened a new restricted access folder and classified it at the highest security level that an analyst of her rank was authorized to use. She did not transmit it to anyone. She was not, yet, certain what transmitting it would mean. The chamber was still not moving. Approximately 4 minutes, Casson said. That is how long you need to begin your own verification. I would suggest using that time to contact Thennic Orbital Command. Las Erdon reached toward the communication interface at his chair. He stopped. If I attempt to contact the orbital, he said, and the channel does not respond, I will know that the claim is credible. If the channel does respond, I will know that it is not. Either outcome, you understand, results in the same conclusion. I do understand, Casson said. Las Erdon completed the gesture. The channel did not respond. The call came through at 14:04. It was not from Thennic Orbital. It was from Las Erdon's protocol secretary, the young Orovith whose faceplates had been cycling amber since the session opened, and his message was not in code. It was bare and clinical. All communication channels to Convocation Fleet Command had been suppressed for the past 9 hours. The suppression had begun at 04:51 standard, 40 minutes before Casson returned to the chamber. Las Erdon received this information the way a thing receives a report that it has already begun to suspect. His faceplates did not cycle. He simply looked at Casson and waited. The seconds counted down on the display Las Erdon had pulled up, the one showing the Thennic Systems stellar monitoring data. 14:05, 14:06. The instability markers were climbing in real time now, cascading through the array. Soon-Keth could see them from her station. She could see, in fact, that every delegate present could see them. The visual feed was not classified. It was open-source data that had belonged to the hegemony all along. Casson was still writing. 14:07 came and went like a heartbeat that had decided to stop being a heartbeat. The Thennic orbital's power signature collapsed to nothing. The stellar event registered on long-range sensors 14 seconds later, a wash of radiation that painted the whole system in sudden heat and then sudden absence. The orbital's last automated transmission cut off mid-packet at 14:08. The chamber did not make a sound. Las Erdan was looking at the display, but soon Keth knew he was not seeing it. His threat processing architecture was cycling through something that had no name in any language the convocation spoke. The Sothran military attaché had sat back down. The Kelthari archivist was writing something in a format that was not their standard notation. Shorthand, urgent, personal. Cassin capped her pen and opened the notebook to a new page. The convocation has now confirmed, she said, that humanity does not require visible weapons to impose consequence. I suggest you verify the following claims before the next deadline passes. She read 6 system designations. Not human systems, hegemony systems. Systems that hosted primary hegemony population centers. Systems that, Soon-Keth understood immediately, had stars that were likely undergoing the same kind of monitoring lag catastrophe the Thenic system had been experiencing for the past 22 months. She ran the verification before Cassin had finished reading the last designation. The data was there. The instability markers were archived. They were real. The hegemony's own monitoring arrays had been collecting them for months. No convocation analyst had thought to look, because looking would have required believing that something was wrong with something they owned, something they controlled, something they had measured as stable according to every model that had ever been built to measure stability. Soon-Keth pulled up the nearest system on the list, the Sothran hegemony's primary industrial center, Velkreth. The instability markers were in the archive. They were in the same low-priority queue. They would have been noticed in 7 weeks at the next quarterly review cycle. 7 weeks too late. She classified that finding at maximum restriction level, the same level as the Thenic data, and then she sat very still and did not transmit it to anyone, because she had made a calculation, in the time it took her to run the verification check, that she did not yet understand the implications of making public. Las Erdan was standing. He was still 2.4 meters of exoskeleton built for authority, but the authority was cracking around the edges. His stabilizing limb had unfolded completely, which was not supposed to happen in formal session. His faceplates were cycling through colors that had no names past blue-gray into something that looked almost like distress. "How long," he said, "have you known about this?" "Long enough," Cassin said. "That is not an answer." Cassin looked at him directly. 160 years. Human intelligence has maintained embedded operations inside hegemony infrastructure for 160 years. Not monitoring, operating. We have been watching your stellar arrays degrade. We have been inside your archival systems. We have known the locations of every primary population center that is at risk from the stellar cascade. The chamber made a sound, not laughter this time. Something that had no translation because it was the sound of 11 species understanding, simultaneously, that they had been inside a calculation they had not known was being made. "You are telling me," Las Erdan said, "that your species has possessed the capability to know about these stellar failures for over a century, that you have kept this knowledge, that you have brought me today into a room where you can demonstrate the consequence of your knowledge without firing a weapon." "I am telling you," Cassin said, "that the Thenic orbital has ceased transmitting. That is a fact. Everything else is a calculation you are welcome to verify on your own." Soon-Keth's instruments were reading Las Erdan's stress response now at a level that indicated his exoskeleton's cooling systems were overloading, which meant he was afraid, which meant that somewhere in the calculation that made him capable of annexing 7 civilizations, there was no category for this. For an enemy that had been inside his infrastructure so long and so deeply that they could predict the future of his own stars better than he could. The communication blackout had lasted 9 hours. The Thenic orbital was confirmed destroyed. The 6 named systems were confirmed at risk. And somewhere in the chamber, someone was beginning to understand that the negotiation had never been what Las Erdan thought it was. It had always been this. Cassin picked up the notebook and turned to another page, a page that had marks and notations that Soon-Keth could not quite read from her station. She read aloud from it anyway. "The Terran Republic's counterdemand remains unchanged," she said. Full military withdrawal from all systems containing human populations within 72 hours. That deadline is now 58 hours away. She set the notebook down again. She did not leave it on the table this time. She held it, and the gesture was not casual. Alternatively, she said, the convocation could submit a request for technical assistance. The Terran Republic has developed expertise over the past century and a half in stellar observation protocols. We could provide updated archival procedures. We could help your systems identify instability markers before they reach cascade threshold. We could prevent the catastrophe that is currently scheduled to affect 6 of your primary population centers. Sunketh's secondary membrane, the tissue beneath her jaw that she did not control consciously, flattened completely. The offer was not an offer. It was a threat that had been dressed in the language of assistance. It was a demonstration of capability that did not require a weapon to execute. It was the moment when Las Erdan understood that his species was no longer negotiating with an opponent they could model mathematically, because the opponent was not an opponent anymore. The opponent was the one holding the notebook, the one who had been paying attention longer than anyone in the room thought possible. Las Erdan did not respond immediately. He stood at the center of the chamber, his faceplate cycling through colors that were not on any standard Orovith emotional register. Behind him, the display was still showing the Thenic system's dead signature. The 6 systems Casson had named were flagged now on the stellar map. Sunketh's instruments were live streaming the verification data, confirmation of instability markers in the archived monitoring feed for 4 of the 6. 4 of 6 confirmed, 2 of 6 still processing. The Sothran military attaché had stood again. His government was one of the 6 at risk. Velkreth, his home system. She had watched his faceplate cycle when Casson named it. She had watched the moment when he understood that the calculation had never favored his government in the first place, that every strategic choice the hegemony had made for the past 200 years had been measured against an enemy that knew which of his stars was dying. If we accept your counter-demand, Las Erdan said, and we withdraw, that does not prevent the stellar cascade. That does not save these 6 systems. No, Casson said. Then you are asking us to surrender, Las Erdan said, in exchange for a consequence we cannot prevent and that you have known about for 160 years. I am asking you, Casson said, to withdraw your forces. What you do after that is not my concern. She reached for the notebook. She did not open it. She simply held it, and the gesture was the only statement she made. Sunketh understood in that moment what the gesture meant. The notebook was not a weapon. It was proof that a weapon was not necessary. It was the ledger of a century and a half of attention. It was the answer to a question that Las Erdan's threat model had never learned to ask. What does an enemy look like if they have been paying attention longer than you have? The Kelthari archivist's secondary palps were flattened completely. The Iron Concordat's delegate was making a sound that the translation system was rendering as something between deliberation and dissent. The Vorn Labor Collective's representative had stopped moving. 11 species, 11 different threat responses to the same realization. They had all been inside the same calculation, and none of them had known it was being made. The first delegation to formally accept the withdrawal demand was the Vorn Labor Collective. It took 47 seconds. They submitted a statement that their forces would begin repositioning within 6 hours. No commentary. No negotiation, no attempt to salvage anything from the transaction. The Sothran hegemony followed at 1 minute and 33 seconds, the Kelthari Dominion at 2 minutes and 9 seconds, the Iron Concordat at 3 minutes and 4 seconds. Each one submitted their withdrawal timeline. Each one understood that what they were witnessing was not a negotiation anymore. It was a cascade. By the time the Orovith continuance, Las Erdan's own government, submitted their formal acceptance at 4 minutes and 58 seconds, the mathematical outcome had already been locked. 11 species, 11 withdrawal confirmations, 0 holdouts, 0 negotiated exceptions, 0 reservations filed. Casson did not look at any of them. She was writing in the notebook again. The chamber was very quiet. Sunketh could hear the sound of the pen. It was the same steady movement she had heard from the very beginning, the first moment, the first session, the moment when the notebook had been opened before the Convener Prime entered the room. The pen had not stopped. It had moved through the reading of terms, through the declaration of counterdemand, through the naming of stars and the revelation of embedded intelligence, and the cascading capitulations of 11 civilizations. It moved now, in the silence that came after. Cassin capped the pen. She closed the notebook. She stood. She looked at Las Erdon for the first time since she had begun reading from the archive designation codes that belonged only to his government. "Thank you," she said, "for your time." She did not collect her materials. The notebook she held, the display terminal she left, the stylus that had marked the pages of her notes, all of it she left on the table as if it had never belonged to her at all. She walked to the chamber's exit. No delegate stopped her. No one spoke. She had walked into the deliberative annex as the representative of a species that was supposed to surrender. She walked out of it as the one who had broken the throne. Sunketh watched her go. Then she turned back to her station, and she opened her formal report, and she sat for 11 minutes before she typed the first word. The report was 11 pages. It contained the full sequence of events. It contained the verified data on the 4 stellar cascade sites. It contained the communication blackout timeline. It contained the delegation-by-delegation capitulation sequence with precise timestamps. It contained her own analysis of human capability penetration. It contained everything except the question that she had answered for herself in those 11 minutes of silence. The question was, what happens to an intelligence officer who verifies that her own government has been inside an enemy calculation for 160 years without knowing it? What happens to her security clearance, her status, her access to the systems that now require a complete reassessment? The question was, if she includes her analysis of the penetration depth and the duration, does that not give the convocation actionable intelligence that it must respond to? And does not responding not require acknowledging that the threat was never external? The question was, if she withholds the analysis, is she protecting her government or enabling the same vulnerability that just resulted in 11 civilizations surrendering to an enemy that never fired a weapon? She made a decision. She typed the final line of her report. Recommend no further inquiry into human stellar capability. Assessment. Investigation would prove counterproductive at this time. She did not explain. She did not list the evidence. She did not include her classified findings in the restricted folder. She filed the report as submitted. Then she stood, and she walked to the center of the deliberative annex, and she looked at the notebook that was still sitting on the table, and she did not touch it. She stood over it the way you stand over something you are not certain is disarmed. 6 months later, aboard the TRCS Ledger, Admiral Vale Cassin sat at a desk that held a new notebook identical to the last, same matte gray cloth covers, same worn corners, same 30-year-old pen clipped to the spine. On the desk in front of her was a document titled, Projected Stellar Events, Terran Boundary and Former Hegemony Core, 40-Year Horizon. The count at the bottom of the final page read, 41. She turned to a fresh page and began to write.